Yeah, I think the Taiwanese dollar, the volatility there in the last couple of weeks have actually taken the market by surprise. And I think it leads to bigger questions in general, largely because of the fact that, the tariff negotiations that the United States will have with all the Asian countries cannot exclude the negotiations on the currency as well. Because, if you impose 10% tariffs on all these countries and if they actually depreciate the currencies by 10%, then you're actually back to neutral. So the currency negotiations have to be a big part of the tariff negotiations, and that in turn will likely affect the equity markets, because in the case of Japan, whenever the yen strengthens, the Japanese equities market actually comes off, largely because a lot of the companies that are listed on the Nikkei are largely export companies, and therefore their earnings, majority of their earnings are actually driven by overseas earnings itself. So the currency negotiations are likely to be a big part of the tariff negotiations.
Yeah, so for you to continue to like Taiwanese equities, there must be some premise around the currency-related negotiations between the U.S. and some of these Asian countries.
Yeah, absolutely. We do think that where Taiwan is concerned, the strength of the Taiwanese dollar might actually affect some of the earnings of the bigger companies there. But in general, we do think that the tech industry still looks pretty healthy, that the earnings growth are likely to actually still be quite strong, given the fact that demand for AI, for data centers, for these chips that the Taiwanese actually have an edge in, will still likely remain quite strong in the foreseeable future. So we do still have a pretty positive outlook on Taiwan, in particular the tech industry.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the bounce back from the lows from April 7th, it's pretty remarkable as well for the TAIEX. Since you mentioned it, and this is really the big picture kind of question, not just for Taiwan as well, but I feel like just looking at the global markets for the last 5 sessions or so, is AI trade back on the table?
At this point in time, we still think yes, it is, largely because if you look at the earnings of the big hyperscalers in the US, the earnings have actually been pretty good. So that has actually sort of like assuaged market concerns with regards to their investments into the AI sector. The AI capital expenditure from these guys are likely to be very important in dictating the path of the earnings growth going forward for a lot of these Taiwanese companies. So if the capex continues to remain pretty high at these levels, then obviously the Taiwanese tech companies will likely actually benefit from that. But again, we need to keep an eye out on the Taiwanese dollar. Any appreciation on a gradual basis is actually fine, but any strong, dramatic overnight appreciation where the Taiwanese dollar is concerned will likely affect the Taiwanese stocks on a short-term basis. But if you take a step backwards, a weaker dollar has always been pretty positive for Asia ex-Japan equities in particular, largely because a lot of the Asian companies do issue debt in the US dollar. And therefore, if the US dollar is weaker, obviously the interest obligations of these Asian companies will be a lot lower. So that also could potentially actually feed into the Taiwanese company sentiments as well.
So, Kelte, listen, this is really obvious, but we haven't talked about it for a long time. Maybe we've forgotten about it. I hope not, right? What about the risk, especially these days now with what's going on between the U.S. and China, this whole tariff war, that China could take advantage of the situation and do something naughty, right? When you take a look at the military exercises around Taiwan, increasing in frequency, it's almost like flies or vultures around a carcass. It's that sort of thing, right? And then, they keep cutting these undersea cables which connect Taiwan to the rest of the world. How should we price that risk?
Well, geopolitics has always been a key factor where the markets are concerned. But I think on a medium to longer term basis, geopolitics actually does not really have an overriding negative impact on the equity markets or even on the bond markets. If you look at how the Russia-Ukraine war, the Palestinian-Israel conflict is actually bore out, they have not really affected negatively the global equity markets and global bond markets. Well, I think equity markets are driven by earnings growth, right? So if earnings growth remains strong, if these companies are nimble enough to actually be able to navigate these challenges, then obviously the earnings will still be there. So I think that's a more important part of it. And of course, a bigger part of it is basically your interest rates, how high your bond yields are, because that in turn actually affects how companies can grow their bottom line.
So look, let's cut right to the chase, right? For Taiwan to survive, right? It's going to be whether or not a name like TSMC, it's probably the most obvious example, is able to onshore their manufacturing capacity, especially their R&D, their brain power, the soft power, right, to the U.S. fast enough ahead of anything China might or might not do. Is that in place? Is that happening fast enough?
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think where Taiwan is concerned, they really need to be nimble in this game. They need to be flexible enough to be able to actually navigate these challenges. If you move all your production to the US, right, and you move all the smart people there, the challenge in the future is that if all the intellectual capacity is actually, or property rights are actually passed on, and the technology transfer is there as well, then obviously Taiwan will become less relevant as a result of that, right? You don't want that to actually happen. Because at some point, the Chinese will be able to come up with their own chips, their own technology that will be quite independent from what we are seeing at this point in time. So this decoupling of the US and China will actually happen, right? It's just a matter of time that the Chinese will actually be able to...
In the tech sphere is what
in
you're
the
saying.
tech sphere, right?
Okay.
It's just a matter of time that the Chinese will be able to come up with their own chip technology. If that's the case, then obviously Taiwan will then will be in a more precarious situation.
Okay.
So I think it's important that Taiwan remains relevant not just to the US, but to the rest of the world, China included as well.